Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about this monstrosity. This is the Harbinger Ascendancy, which is temporarily coming to Path of Exile 1 in the upcoming Legacy of Frisia event. The Legacy of Frisia event is something Grinding Gear Games only decided to put on during this week, and it was a response to the backlash after 3.26 was delayed. In many ways, I'm starting to think of this as 3.25 and a half, if that makes any sense. This is going to be something a little bit smaller in scope than a normal league, but because it's something that's an event rather than a league, it means that things don't need to be super polished, but they can also be more experimental as a result. And that's certainly what these new Ascendancies are going to be. All 19 of the normal Ascendancies will be banned in the Legacy of Frisia event, at least if I'm reading Grinding Gear Games' announcements correctly. However, there'll be a new 19 Ascendancies that you can play around with. Now, today's video is going to be talking about the Harbinger, looking at some of the options that will be available there, some of the strengths of some of these nodes, some of their weaknesses, and also what these cryptic things like Summon Greater Harbinger of Time actually do. Because there's a number of little known items in the game that already provide these skills, so they do actually already exist. What I want to do is go around this in a clockwise direction, starting from this right arm. So it's quite difficult to give these things a name. They're all in Harbinger Krangle text, but we'll start with the one that's 40% increased cooldown recovery rate. A quick side note though, I will just mention here that I did a stream where I discussed all of this in a first thoughts basis. This is going to be my more polished thoughts on it after discussing with other people, some of whom have pointed out things that I got wrong in that. If you do want to see the stream, I'll put it up on the screen in the last 20 seconds of this video. So 40% increased cooldown recovery rate is a bad stat except for when it's not. Now I know you're thinking that's one of the most profound statements I've ever made, but it is the case that for the vast majority of builds, this doesn't do very much. However, there are a small number of builds where this is absolutely transformative to the way they play. This is something I was quite dismissive of when I first thought of it, but I've been convinced since that I was underestimating this. There are a number of spell trigger mechanics like cast on critical strike, cast while channeling, and the like. Some of these get a significant boost from increased cooldown recovery rate. Sometimes this can be really, really substantial, and that means that you can potentially get to higher breakpoints, which means that you can proc more spell casts per second. More spell casts per second is the equivalent of increased cast speed for other classes. The thing is though, that increased cast speed is something that while it's always a pretty valuable stat in Path of Exile 1, it is one that you can get in a lot of different places. Increased cooldown recovery rate is something that Path of Exile 1 is quite stingy on for good reason, and that's why 40% is actually more than I'd initially thought. To give a bit of a sense as to how scarce this stat is, you can get 16 to 20% of it as a suffix on a Shaper influenced belt. Now, you can definitely get this on a Shaper influenced Stygian Vice because Stygian Vices are the best belts in Path of Exile 1, but doing so is non-trivial. You need to source a Stygian Vice of appropriate level, then you need to apply an Elder Slayer's Exalted Orb to it. That will make it one of the Elder Slayer influences, not the Hunter ones, they're the most expensive. And after that, it's an average of 5 applications of randomize the influence of a particular item until you hit Shaper. That costs 1,000 blue harvest goo every time you do it. So creating one of these crafting bases alone is going to cost you an average of 1 Elder Slayer Exalted Orb and 5,000 harvest blue goo. Even then, you've still got to roll it. Rolling it's not so hard though, it's getting good other mods with it. That's where this can be quite difficult. Now there's a number of things you can do. You can use this in conjunction with an Awakener's Orb and potentially get yourself a really good belt that way, but that's only going to lock in 2 mods. Or you can potentially just get lucky, you can potentially trade, you can do all sorts of other harvest shenanigans. But you're only getting 20% of this stat on your belt. And whilst there's a couple of other sources of it, they're also not very generous. 40% is probably one of the most generous sources of this stat in the game, and so it ends up being more significant than I initially considered it. Now there is a very, very important thing that you need to know if you're wanting to build around this, and this is the concept of breakpoints. In Path of Exile 1, it's not just as simple as you can start at performing an action whenever you want. There are quantized little bits of time that the game does that are called server ticks, and essentially, anytime that you initiate an action, then your initiated action gets sent to the game, gets sent to the server, and then the server starts it as a batch with everything else that came on that same server tick. Now, this is approximately 33 milliseconds or 1/30th of a second. So, if your cast time for a skill is 5.02 server ticks, and then you can pull this down to 4.97 server ticks if you're just holding down the button to just keep spamming casting that spell. In the first scenario, you're going to start it at time is 0. Then when it comes to time is 5 server ticks, you still haven't quite finished the previous cast, and so your next cast is going to be delayed until 6 server ticks. However, when you've got 4.98 instead, your first cast finishes before the 5th server tick starts, and then when the 5th server tick starts, you cast the spell again. So essentially going from 5.03 to 4.98, even though it's only 1% faster in cast time, you've actually increased your throughput of skills per second from 5 skills per second all the way up to 6. This is a really, really substantial increase. It's 20% more damage. It's equivalent to 20% more cast speed. The same thing can apply with cooldown recovery rate. However, the mathematics behind this is extremely complicated. There are breakpoints that vary from cast on critical strike to all sorts of other different skills that you could use with this. You're going to need to learn that maths if you want to play with a build that does this, or alternately, you're going to need to do some research from someone else who has learnt these mathematics. So keep that in mind. Very complex mechanics that you'll need to optimize if you want to truly min-max something based around triggering skills and increasing your CDR in order to trigger them faster. It may well be that going from 80% to 89% achieves nothing in CDR, but going from 89 to 90% is one of the biggest upgrades your character can get. Next up, we have Summon Greater Harbinger of Time. Now, this is something that does exist already in the game, and Summon Greater Harbinger of Time is found on the belt Torrent's Reclamation. Torrent's Reclamation is an item that comes out of the Infused Beachhead, and in fact, all of these Greater Harbingers, all of them are tied to items that come from the Infused Beachhead. The Infused Beachhead is a rare drop when you complete the Tier 15 Beachhead, which comes from applying Harbinger Orbs to red tier maps. So, there's a number of layers of RNG in order to get a chance at getting into the Infused Beachhead. When you beat it, you'll get a scroll that will upgrade one of the base Harbinger items into one of the Uber versions. And the Torrent's Reclamation then has this Summon Greater Harbinger of Time skill on it. Now, Greater Harbinger of Time provides a 10% increased action speed buff. The greater version of it, which comes from the Torrent's Reclamation, this version applies only to the player. It does not apply to enemies. The regular version of Summon Harbinger of Time, which comes on the Flow Untethered unique belt, which is an easier to source Harbinger belt, that one also applies the effect to enemies. Now, these Harbingers work in a pretty oddball way. They conjure a minion that follows you around. This minion doesn't get into fights for you. What it does is it occasionally casts a buff on you. And then this lasts 8 seconds. This is cast on you every 10 seconds. So by default, your uptime for this skill is 80%. However, there are a couple of stats that you can get that will push this up to 100%. For example, the unique amulet, the Solstice Vigil, which is one of the more rare items that comes from the Shaper, this causes effects on you and nearby allies to expire 20% slower. If you don't have any other sources of this stat, it still is enough on its own to make the Summon Greater Harbinger of Time effect work all of the time on you. Additionally, there are other options inside the Harbinger tree that will achieve the same thing. For example, buffs on you expire 30% slower, debuffs on you expire 30% faster. Again, I wish I could pronounce this Krangle text here, but unfortunately, that's something I'm unable to do. So that's Summon Greater Harbinger of Time. That's what it does. It's 10% action speed. You can think of it as Tailwind, and by default, it has an 80% uptime, but it is something that can be taken further with a little bit more investment, and that little bit more investment is something you're probably going to spec into. Now, second up, we have the Greater Harbinger of Focus skill. Now, Summon Greater Harbinger of Focus normally comes from the Immortal Will. This is a shield, again, that is tied to that Uber Beachhead content. This has some pretty complex mechanics behind it. This is all about channeling, so if you're not playing a channeling build, probably don't bother with the Harbinger of Focus. However, if you are actively channeling a skill, then the Summon Greater Harbinger of Focus will every 8 seconds attempt to cast on you a buff. This has a 4-second duration, so by default you would have 50% uptime on this, and this buff is really quite strong. It provides outright immunity to ailments, stun immunity, 20% damage reduction, and immunity to curses. The drawback, however, is that this is by default only a 50% uptime, and you only get the 50% uptime when you are constantly channeling. If you haven't channeled in the last 8 seconds, you've got no chance of having this active on you. However, if you're able to cause buffs on you to expire slower, through various means, such as the 2-pointer that leads up to Summon Greater Harbinger of Focus, that will substantially increase the uptime of the Immortal Will. Now, you will also notice that the Immortal Will lists that there is a 6-second cooldown associated with the Greater Harbinger of Focus skill. What that means is that the act of summoning the Greater Harbinger of Focus is on a 6-second cooldown, so summoning it or turning it off. However, the Harbinger's own abilities, they have an 8-second cooldown. So there's quite a number of defensive benefits here if you're willing to jump through all the hoops that are associated with playing a channeling build. Now, the main channeling skill that gets used is Cyclone. You could definitely consider running the Immortal Will in conjunction with a Cyclone build, and potentially, who knows, maybe you want to also be doing Cyclone cast on Critical Strike, and then that could potentially do things. So there's a whole lot of things that you could consider there. Or alternately, you might try and mess around with one of the less played skills. Stormburst definitely does a lot of damage, but it also has a lot of clunk associated with it. If you can make that work, then all power to you. Flame Blast is a good skill in general, but I really think that the channeling skill that people might consider playing around with here is going to be Winter Orb. Lots of different options to consider though if you do elect to go with Summon Greater Harbinger of Focus. The next arm around is something that's devoted to channeling as well. However, I don't think there's much synergy here because this does too many of the same things that Greater Harbinger of Focus does. You're immune to curses, unaffected by chill, and unaffected by shock while you're channeling. However, a whole bunch of these are things you would otherwise get from Greater Harbinger of Focus anyway. I'm sure there'll be the odd situation where someone wants to take these 2 nodes and then potentially these 2 nodes and then one of the other Greater Harbingers and still wants to get like a piece of the power that you would get from Greater Harbinger of Focus. In that case, maybe you would go down this way, but I think for most people, this is going to be the weakest node. From the weakest node to the most generally powerful node, we have the Temporal Chains cluster. The Temporal Chains arm is going to cause Temp Chains to have no reservation if cast as an aura. Now, this is something that you would also get on Solstice Vigil when we were talking before about that amulet. That also has this line of text. Temp Chains has no reservation if it's cast as an aura. So what this means is if you link Temp Chains to Blasphemy, then you're going to find that you're going to have a good time. It's not going to tie up any of your mana to have a Blasphemy aura going all the time. Now, the increased area is very welcome because Temp Chains is something that just works better when it's hitting more monsters, and it's also just much more reliable. Can create quite a powerful defense for you. The other thing that's really good about this is just passively applying a Hex all the time in case you would want to hit enemies with something like Hex Blast. Now, when I was doing that stream that I mentioned earlier, it took me a while to realize that Hex Blast actually works a bit differently to Cursed Ground support. There's a number of ways that you can cause your hexes to affect an area instead of their intended behavior of just being cast. Now, Temporal Chains, when it's linked to Cursed Ground, it affects an area on the ground. If you remove that through the use of Hex Blast, the monster has to exit the area that's affected by Cursed Ground and then walk back into it in order to be affected by that hex again. However, when an enemy is inside one of your Blasphemy curses, if they lose the hex as a result of you detonating a Hex Blast on top of them, then that's actually fine because 250 milliseconds later, the hex is going to come back. It'll be automatically reapplied. This could potentially be quite powerful if you wanted to self-cast Hex Blast. And I feel like that is exactly what this section of the tree is all about. Additionally, we have cooldown recovery rate here as well, and that might incentivize you to trigger Hex Blast. Lots of ways you could do this. You could try and do it through Cast on Critical Strike. You could try and do it through Cast while Channeling. It's all up to you, really. The key thing is that cooldown recovery rate is a very powerful stat if you're triggering your Hex Blast, because Hex Blast has that really annoying text that this skill's cast time is added on to the cooldown if it's triggered. So 40% increased CDR is very, very beneficial there. All that said, lots of different options there. Going to take a little bit of time playing around to work out which of these is best. Now, the final cluster that you can get leads to Summon Greater Harbinger of the Arcane. Again, this is one of those things that you can normally only get on a particular weapon, and that is the Surging Thoughts. This is another one of those items that is tied to the Uber version of the Beachhead encounter. The Surging Thoughts is a weapon that almost feels good enough to use, but never quite gets there. It's one of those Spellblade / Gish weapons that feel really cool to use, where you are both doing damage with your attack, and then you're also triggering down an arcane payload. Very similar to Mjolnir, very similar to the feel of Cast on Critical Strike builds, but without the requirement to go Critical Strike. Now, the Surging Thoughts grants you the Summon Greater Harbinger of the Arcane skill, which is already good, and it triggers level 20 Storm Cascade when you attack, which is kind of similar to the player skill Glacial Cascade, but deals lightning damage instead. Then on top of that, it's got increased spell damage, a reasonable amount of physical damage, not a truly tremendous amount, but a reasonable amount, and then some lightning damage that's added and some ink AoE. However, if you separate the Surging Thoughts item from Greater Harbinger of the Arcane, what Greater Harbinger of the Arcane on its own does for you is it provides you with a high amount of uptime on Arcane Surge, and on top of that, it grants a second buff that grants you Shock Chance and Lightning Penetration. That then allows you to play it alongside something totally different. You're no longer pigeonholed into using this particular weapon. Instead, you can go and use something completely and utterly different. Like for instance, you might elect to use Mjolnir instead of the Surging Thoughts, and that can be something that's a better way to proc a payload of spells. Ultimately, I think that's going to be one of the more interesting build-around things, but of course, you are going to require a fair bit of setup to make this one work. Okay, so what's my final thoughts on the Harbinger Ascendancy? My initial thoughts on this haven't really changed all that much since when I was doing my live stream. I feel like power-wise, this is closer to the Assassin than it is to the Trickster. This is going to be a serviceable Ascendancy. It will be the best at a couple of things, but it's not going to be something people will be clamoring to play if they're just looking for power. If you're looking for power, you'll probably find it with one of the others. Ultimately, I think this is going to reward playing around and designing new things. I think there's a lot of different ways that you could take a character here, but none of them jump out as being absolutely phenomenal. Instead, just a lot of solid options, which is a pretty good spot for an Ascendancy to be in, especially in a short-lived event. Anyways, that's the Harbinger Ascendancy. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and please don't use them on the text of your Ascendancy notables.